So as a bit of a refresher on these systems, we have our autonomic nervous system and its two subsections. So when we have our autonomic nervous system, I always remember this, that the autonomic system is automatic. This is stuff that's happening in the background without our conscious awareness. So this is going to be maintaining things like heart rate and breathing and digestion that we really don't have a lot of say in. So this is the stuff that just happens without our control. You might remember that the sort of pair to this, the other half of this, if the autonomic is the automatic, our somatic nervous system is the stuff where we're doing intentional actions. So when you decide to move a particular way or to change something or move something or do something intentional, it's that somatic system. But we really care for this section about our autonomic nervous system because it has our two main components here, our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. And so the sympathetic nervous system is the one that we're going to care the most about. That's our fight or flight system, and that's the one that's going to start by triggering the release of our stress hormones to sort of cascade and cause our full-blown stress responses. Our parasympathetic nervous system is the one that gets involved in trying to get us back to normal. So if our fight or flight, if our sympathetic nervous system is ramping us up, it's going to be doing that thing like dilating our pupils to let more light in. It's going to slow down our digestion so we can send those resources elsewhere. Dry mouth because we don't need that extra salivation to get in the way. We're going to start having sort of blushed cheeks and things like that, not because the blush on our cheeks is beneficial, but specifically because we're sending extra blood to our extremities, to our muscles, so that we're preparing for that fighting or running. That goes along with our increased heart rate. We do also experience tunnel vision, which is kind of weird, but because we're dilating our pupils, we're letting in more information, but we're also going to be focusing in or paying a lot more attention on whatever it is that we've deemed to be a threat. So if it is that bear dog that's come through the door, that's going to be holding our focus. We're going to be paying a lot of attention to that, and we might be excluding other stimuli if they're deemed irrelevant. And as part of this process, some of our hormones are going to end up releasing extra energy. We're going to start having more free-flowing glucose in our blood so that not only do we get extra air from things like our lungs taking in more air as we breathe faster, but we're also going to have that extra glucose easily broken down to give us the extra energy. So all of these systems or all of these changes are getting us ready to run or fight, and that's why they're part of that system. But if we wanted to look at the diagram here, let's see, do I have, perfect. I wanted to make sure that I have the words while we go along with the diagram here. But we're going to look at our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And this is conveniently named because it's going to involve our hypothalamus, our pituitary, and our adrenal glands. So the first step is actually going to be our amygdala, signaling to our hypothalamus to let it know that there is something that's worth being stressed out about. So the amygdala is doing that early evaluation. Is there something that's potentially threatening? Are we afraid or are we angry? If yes, let's start this process. So it's going to send this signal to our hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be signaled to release this corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. And so you can see that in the diagram here. And CRH is going to keep over to our pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, another one nicely on the diagram here, which signals our adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are going to be releasing cortisol. Cortisol is our big stress hormone here. This is one of the biggest ones because it's going to be circulating throughout the body, and it's going to be having a lot of different effects. That's basically what's going to be triggering those physical effects that we had listed previously, the ones that are listed in the diagram here. But typical typically we have cortisol circulating in our bodies in varying levels pretty much all day, every day. So it's going to fluctuate as we encounter fairly normal stressors. But as we encounter more intense situations, the levels are going to rise pretty dramatically. And in a lot of the research, we end up having cortisol it's something that people choose to monitor as a direct correlate with stress levels. So if you've ever participated in a stress study, they might take a saliva sample or a blood sample or even a hair sample to try and measure the different levels of cortisol circulating in your blood. The higher the levels, the greater the stress that you are under. So we could use cortisol and measures of cortisol in whatever form as our operational definition of stress, and that's something that's been used pretty widely in the research already, so we'd be pretty comfortable using that measure, which is kind of neat. But yeah, we have these levels of cortisol start spiking as quickly as, say, 15 to 20 minutes after encountering an acute stressor. So if that bear dog breaks down the door, but 15, 20 minutes later, we can actually measure your blood levels and see that there was a spike in this hormone. And so if you kind of remember back, we have our nervous system and our endocrine system. Both of them are going to be working together to send signals throughout the body. Our nervous system mostly operates in terms of our electrical signals or our action potentials within the neurons, as well as, say, our neurotransmitters between neurons. But because it's mostly the electrical signals, those signals travel quickly and give us a fairly immediate response. So when we're having that signal from our amygdala to the hypothalamus within the brain, that's still going to be that nervous system side of things. That's still going to be an electrical signal for the most part. So it happens fairly quickly. But if we think about it, when we start releasing hormones are generally released into our bloodstream. So they don't have the same direct line that we would have for our electrical signals. We kind of have to wait for them to start circulating to get where they need to go. And especially in this pathway where we have a couple of different hormones that are released and we kind of have to wait for them to go from area to area, this is going to be a little bit of a slower acting pathway. That's why it can take that 15 to 20 minutes. But once it's released into the blood, that's when it's going to be some longer term processes. So it's going to stick around for much longer. So when we start looking at chronic stress, we would have very long-term exposure to these higher levels of cortisol. So it might not be as quick, but it's going to be much longer term in terms of its duration. And that's why there's actually this secondary pathway here where we have our stimulation of that, oh man, I'm already drawing the blank. We just talked about it. Sympathetic nervous system. There we go. Where the sympathetic nervous system is going to directly stimulate those adrenal glands. And we can actually have some other stress hormones, our epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to cause some more immediate responses. So because we get to sort of skip these two stages of hormones, the direct stimulation from that sympathetic nervous system gets us a little bit of a faster response. But it's going to peter out much quicker because it's the nervous system and not the endocrine system to start. So it's kind of good to keep in mind that we have these two systems working together to try and get us to the same outcome, which is to be prepared for a threat. But we get sort of one that's fast and short duration, one that's slower but longer lasting. So if we kind of take a step back and look at all of these different physical effects, I suppose we should talk about what else it's influencing, because it's not just that cortisol goes directly to our eyes and immediately causes the dilation of pupils. There's other systems that are involved kind of in the background. And we're going to hand wave a lot of that, but we want to kind of keep in mind that this is going to end up triggering things like our cardiovascular system or our respiratory system and our digestive systems. And so when they're affecting these other systems, they can cause changes there. And so when we start looking at longer term stressors, things like having our heart rate increased, things like ramping up that cardiovascular system, that can actually put more strain on that system in the long run. So individuals who already had, say, poor cardiovascular health, if they're under chronic stress conditions, that can actually cause more wear and tear, more damage to those systems. And that's why we typically tend to see correlations with things like high levels of stress, and as well as things like, say, heart attacks or strokes or things like that. So if you think about it, it's basically like we're putting the extra strain on systems, and if you had a predisposition to those systems not working optimally, you can start seeing problems in the long run. Another thing, so with our digestive systems, so if we're affecting how we digest food, you've probably experienced this. Maybe you get stressed about taking tests, or you get stressed when you have to give a presentation, and then your stomach gets sick and everything's really acidy and you get heartburn and you feel really gross, and maybe you spend most of the morning before your test in the bathroom, and if that goes on long term, it can cause problems with that digestive system, things like ulcers. And say erosion in your esophagus because of constant heartburn. So again, having these systems affected sort of outside of their normal operational limits can then cause health concerns that relate to those. And then the last one that I wanted to make sure that I got in here was the fact that this fight or flight system is basically going to also, it triggers a suppression of insulin. So it's going to reduce the release of insulin in our pancreas, and that is basically going to stop us from storing excess glucose. So our insulin is supposed to be involved in maintaining proper glucose levels, so when it's present, it's going to help us store it away for later. But as we mentioned before, if we're going to need that extra energy, if we're going to need to fight or run, we don't want that to be stored away. So we can turn off the system that's doing that. So by reducing our insulin levels, we're leaving more of that glucose free and available in our bloodstream so that it can go out to other areas where we're going to need it. That can, again, cause some problems, though, if it's going to be affecting how we store and retrieve energy. Because long term, if you're not storing that energy, well, where is it going to be coming from? Also, if we're not digesting food to get more glucose, where is that glucose going to be coming from? And so with cortisol, it's going to affect a lot of things that relate to how we store or retrieve different types of nutrients. But cortisol facilitates our transformation of fatty acids into glucose. So basically, by having more cortisol around, we're going to take fatty acids, some stores of different kinds of energy, and we're going to convert it into easily accessible energy. So because we can't digest and because we're not storing the normal way, we're going to kind of start shortcutting and burning through some of our extra stores. But this can cause problems again because we're pulling from areas we're not supposed to. And so in the long run, it can lead to things like dramatic fluctuations in weight, or pulling from fat stores that maybe we don't have, and things like that. So in the short term, it's kind of better than, say, being attacked by our bear. But in the long term, it can have some effects on the rest of our health systems. And we already did the fight, flight, or freeze, so I mentioned that freezing is another viable option that's only recently been introduced. So we don't have to touch on that again. But our next section is to start talking about, well, okay, if our amygdala is increasing some of this, if that's going to send that initial signal that lets our hypothalamus know that this is happening and it starts sending out all these signals, well, how do we keep it all under control? This isn't going to be something that's completely in a runaway system. There has to be some sort of regulation. And typically within our bodies, we use something that are called feedback loops. And feedback loops basically say that the output from one system is going to influence the output of another system through either a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop means that one system's output increases another system's output. For a negative feedback loop, one of the system's outputs will then reduce the functioning of the other system. So typically, if we're trying to maintain homeostasis, we're usually going to be using these negative feedback loops. And specifically, our HPA axis is definitely negative feedback loops, where as we release one thing, we say, okay, well, we started this stress response, but we don't want it to start running away with itself. We don't want a cascade of those stress hormones. We don't need tons of cortisol and tons of norepinephrine and tons of epinephrine. What we need is a balanced level. So as they're released, we're going to have feedback that says, okay, there's this much released, so slow down on your releasing. And as it gets broken down in the bloodstream, we can release a little bit more, but we're going to be trying to maintain certain acceptable levels of these different hormones without overwhelming our system. Positive feedback loops are a lot rarer. And in fact, I can't actually think of an example off the top of my head, which is probably a good thing. But yeah, so our autonomic nervous system can also work through a process called reciprocal inhibition, which basically says that we have our two systems that are going to be working opposing one another. So as our sympathetic nervous system is activating, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be inhibiting. And so it's going to keep it under control. So where the HPA axis involves partially our autonomic nervous system, it also has those negative feedback loops to keep the levels constant. But when we're just looking at sympathetic versus parasympathetic, they're paired and they're going to push against one another to try and maintain those homeostatic levels without needing separate loops, at least not that we care about directly. The next slide is about our immune system. And this is the part that I find really, really interesting. So our immune system is definitely going to be affected by what the other systems within our body are doing. So one of the biggest things that's studied is our inflammatory response. And this is a pretty standard immune system response to injury and infection, but it can also kick in response to psychological stressors as well. The base idea for this inflammatory response is for our bodies to sort of warm up. So if you get a fever, that's part of an inflammatory response. Or if you've had a cut and it starts to get puffy and red, that's usually because there's extra blood flow to that area. It's usually warmer than the surrounding areas. And all of that is designed or has evolved to help us fight off any foreign invaders, things like viruses and bacteria, but also to bring extra resources to the damaged areas to help us start recovering and repairing any damaged tissues. But a lot of the research into stress realizes that a lot of our acute stressors can activate this same inflammatory response. So even if there isn't physical damage, even if it's just the psychological damage, we can still have an increase in a lot of these proteins that are involved in this inflammation response. So these are our cytokines, and so they're going to help us regulate how much inflammation we experience. And so the idea is that, yeah, this under normal stress situations, if we're fighting off a threat, if we're fighting off something that has physically harmed us, we want this kind of a response in the long term to help fix our injuries. But in our non-physical threats, we're going to have the same kind of response. We're going to be pulling the same kind of resources. We're going to be drawing on that system, even if there isn't something that's there to be fixed. So one of the ideas is that when we have this prolonged inflammatory response, it's basically putting high stress on that immune system. So just like before when we were saying, well, hey, if you're putting extra stress on your cardiovascular system by ramping up your heart rate, by breathing more and deeper and pushing blood around faster, same thing here is we're pulling resources from our immune system that's going to be pulling them from other areas and therefore reducing its effectiveness. So the longer our stress responses can go on, the more we're pulling from this and the less effective that it can be. I always think of, say, when you get to the end of the semester, you get into sort of your final exam season, and you've been pushing and stressing and working, and you've written all of your exams, and you finally finish, and you take that deep breath, and usually you sleep for like 12 hours that first night because you're in that sleep deprivation mode, and within the next day or two, you get the scratching in your throat, and all of a sudden you're really, really sick. And usually what's happened is that in that prolonged chronic stress period, we've worn down our immune system to the point that when we finally take that step back, we finally let ourselves relax, we don't have the resources left to fight anything off, and we're going to pretty much end up getting sick with whatever we encounter first in the environment. So it's definitely not the best thing to happen, but it is fairly common for it to happen. I do want to mention one particular individual, and this is Hans Selye, which I'm not great with the pronunciation of names, but he's credited as the father of stress research, because he was really, really pushing for this idea of the roles that stress can take within our lives. And he was especially influential because he focused not just on the potential negative aspects of stress, because most of stress research really just looks at the downsides of the bad stuff that can come from it. And in fact, when we look at, say, the title of the chapter, talking about health and stress, we usually assume that the more stressed we are, the worse our health can be. But Selye was basically saying that it depends on the type of stress. And in fact, we can have either good or bad stress. So he called this eustress and distress. But to his quote here, he says that stress is unavoidable, and in fact, it would be undesirable to avoid it. I have often said that stress is the spice of life. It can be a great stimulus to achievement. So kind of tying into what would have been covered in 104 if you took it on motivation and emotion, where we can have stressors as these things that are kind of pushing us to achieve more than we might have achieved when left to our own devices. So maybe taking a really hard class was just the kick in the pants you needed to sort of beef up your studying habits, or try really hard, or get a tutor or something to do better. So he's saying that, yeah, stress can be sometimes just what you need to reach accomplishments you wouldn't get to otherwise. Which then brings us to the good and the bad stress. Eustress meaning good stress. And this is going to be looking at our external circumstances or internal emotional experiences or bodily responses, are 3 different ways of framing stress things, but that can be beneficial or motivating. So an example of eustress would be something like marriage, or getting a promotion at work, or having some kind of conquerable everyday challenge. So maybe on my route to work, because I picked a different direction, I went a different way, maybe I found a new route and I feel very accomplished because I went somewhere else, I found a new neighborhood, or I found something new or exciting. So by trying new things, or by being pushed to try new things or experience new things, that can technically be beneficial. And so one of the biggest focuses here is that this is something that's going to be manageable, something that's going to push us without breaking us. So it's accomplishable. Whereas distress or bad stress is going to be the same starting, the external circumstances or internal emotional experiences or bodily responses that can be harmful, reduce motivation, or impair functioning. Basically, if stuff is too intense, if it's too stressful, it can cause us to shut down. It can cause harm, and it can make sure that we do poorly on a particular topic. So if you're in a class and it's challenging, but it's achievable, maybe you're in a class and you're doing, I don't know, organic chemistry, but you have a really, really good instructor. So it's a very, very hard topic, but you have someone who really gives you the tools that you need to accomplish the goals in that class. We could frame that as eustress, where, yeah, it is stressful, but you're being pushed, you're being supported to do better. Whereas if you have an awful instructor and it's stressful and you don't have the tools and there's no way for you to accomplish it, it might reduce your motivation. It might lead you to give up on that class. You might drop the course without even trying. So it would be more detrimental than beneficial. And this is going to be a lot of how we frame this information or how we frame concepts. We can view things as potentially positive or potentially negative, depending on the situations. But yeah, there's a lot of different things that we can consider good or bad, depending on ourselves. Now, I'm not just bringing up Hans Selye because of his contributions talking about eustress and distress and focusing on that positive versus negative framing for stress. He was also really famous for the fact that he proposed what we call the general adaptation syndrome, which is one of the ways that we can actually describe how our bodies react to stress and how we're going to sort of deal with it and then also recover from it afterwards. But this syndrome is basically talking about our physiological reaction to prolonged stress, and specifically how our resistance to stress changes over time when we're facing sort of a long-term or chronic stressor situation. And so we're going to break it down into 3 phases: our alarm phase, then the resistance phase, and then that exhaustion phase at the end. And we'll actually see those parallels to getting that week off and then going home and getting sick would be more of that exhaustion phase when we sort of slow down and are then more susceptible to things because of that drop at the end. But if we look at this diagram here, it's one of those weird, it has some strange axes on it. So we're looking at resistance to stress, no units, no real measurement, just a feeling, I guess. And then across the bottom is assumed to be time, but again, no real units. But we're looking at sort of our beginning stage. Stage 1 is our alarm reaction. So that would be when you're first faced with a big stressor. So maybe this is the start of the semester and you realize you signed up for the hardest course ever, and you're probably going to be stressed for the rest of the term. So we have this momentary dip where we're going to have this thing that's stressing us out. That's usually going to start pulling some resources. There's an initial, oh my gosh, I'm not going to do well. Maybe some panic, so you're not going to be doing great. And then our shift is going to switch over to our sympathetic nervous system. That's going to kick in and it's going to ramp up all of our systems. It's going to get us into that fight or flight mode. We're also going to have that endocrine system activating, getting our cortisol and the longer term responses. That's going to get us ramping up to handle a stressor. So that's when we have this increase in our resistance. And this white line in the middle is just our generic normal level of resistance to stress. So that would be sort of like our baseline. That's where we usually sit. But because we've activated systems that are specialized to help us cope with stress, we're going to be doing a lot better while they're active. We enter into our stage 2, aptly named resistance, because we've ramped up that resistance. We're kicking into our adrenal glands, that endocrine system being active. The adrenal glands are releasing all of our stress hormones, so we mostly talk about cortisol, but we also get epinephrine and norepinephrine, and they're going to help us maintain that increased level of arousal, that increased level of activation for a much longer term period. That's going to be our long-term stress response. We rely much, much less on our nervous system at that point because the endocrine system's that long-term reliance. But as we mentioned before, we only have so many resources. We can only maintain a stress response for so long, and eventually we transfer over into the exhaustion phase. So our adrenal glands are basically going to lose their ability to continue functioning at those elevated levels, and stuff's going to drop off. And so we get back down to our normal levels, but we're going to have depleted our resources so much that we're actually going to dip into that lower level. So we're even more susceptible to stress now, because now we're not capable of producing a response to counteract those stressors. So we're going to have that sort of longer term exhaustion where we just can't handle it. We're overwhelmed. That's usually that point where maybe if you've been ramped up all semester, maybe you just run out of resources. Maybe you crash right before reading week. In fact, they try and time reading week in the semester to sort of prevent people from having that mid-semester crash. One of the reasons why they put one in fall as well as winter. That's a fairly new addition, but it's meant to kind of help reduce those levels of stress and the stuff that comes from it. So maybe we can counteract that, maybe we can head it off, but maybe you crash right before reading week and you need that time to recuperate, to recover. Maybe you were like me and slept most of your reading week. That might be a part of your recovery to get back to normal, to prepare for your next stressor. And we actually have the words that go along with all of these, where the alarm phase is that activation of our sympathetic nervous system. We start the release of our stress hormones. We're going to try and, those stress hormones are involved in increasing the number of blood sugars circulating throughout our system. So sugars in our blood, that glucose circulating, is going to give us very easy access to lots of extra energy. That's that initial fight or flight response, getting our muscles ready to fight a threat or run away from a threat. We also have a suppression of the immune system at that phase, and that's actually going to be a long-term problem. But basically, we're trying to avoid using energy that we can't afford to be using. That's also why we end up doing things like shutting down our digestive system. So when you're first faced with a stressor, you might feel sort of that rumbling in your stomach or that dropping feeling in your stomach, because we're affecting how that's operating. Of course, we can't rely on that nervous system response indefinitely. That's why we shift over to the longer term endocrine system. So we're going to have to shift away from that, because we know that if our sympathetic nervous system is activated, the parasympathetic nervous system is there and ready to try and push us back into homeostasis. The two are going to be working, opposing each other to try and maintain that balance. But if we have a persistent stressor, that thing in our environment that's stressing us out, the response is going to persist, and that's when we shift to that longer term response, which is the stage 2. So we continue recruiting our resources. We're using our endocrine system to maintain that. It's less of the short term and more of a long-term prolonged exposure. And again, it can't last forever because we're depleting resources, and eventually we run out and get into that exhaustion phase. So the resources are depleted, and now we don't have stuff available for other systems either. So this can make us susceptible to illness and disease just because our immune system doesn't have the energy it needs to keep functioning. Can also tie into other things. We're going to actually see later on in the lecture that there are other illnesses and sort of long-term effects that we can see if you have these stress responses long-term. And the more high stress events you're exposed to, the more detrimental problems you can have with things like your cardiovascular system. So if you have lots of large-scale stressors, or if you're under sort of low-level stress for very long periods of time, it puts extra strain on your heart and your lungs and your circulatory system, which can then cause it to wear down and lead to problems in the future. Difficulties with our immune system and a whole bunch of other stuff. We'll even see that something as simple as, say, arthritis. There's a higher incidence of arthritis in individuals in high stress situations. So we have these long-term studies that we can look at later.